It was a warm July evening in 1994 when the Miller family seemed to vanish from existence. Their small suburban home sat at the edge of Maplewood, a quiet town where neighbors knew one another and nothing truly dangerous ever seemed to happen. That night, the family had eaten dinner together. Plates of half-eaten food and glasses of milk were still sitting on the dining table. The television hummed softly in the living room, and the ceiling fan turned lazily, as if frozen in time. Everything about the house suggested a normal evening, but the Millers themselves were gone. The next morning, when a neighbor noticed the Millers' dog barking nonstop in the backyard, they assumed it was just restless. But by evening, concern began to grow. The family car was still in the driveway, untouched. The curtains remained open, and the lights inside the house flickered on as the timer switched them. Yet not a single member of the Miller family was seen entering or leaving. Calls went unanswered, and the children never showed up for their summer playdates. When police were called in to investigate, they found the home disturbingly ordinary. The front and back doors were locked from the inside. No windows were broken. The beds upstairs had been slept in, but not made. The closets still contained clothes, and even the children's favorite toys were untouched on the bedroom floor. It was as though the entire family had been plucked from their lives in an instant, leaving everything behind. What unsettled investigators most was the eerie silence surrounding the disappearance. There were no signs of a struggle, no notes, no calls to 911. The neighbors, who lived only a few feet away, insisted they hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the house during the night. The only strange detail anyone could recall was the sound of the Miller's dog barking frantically, as if it sensed something no one else could. The animal, exhausted by mourning, had scratched its paws raw trying to get inside. Rumors spread quickly through Maplewood. Some whispered that the family had staged their disappearance, others spoke of something darker, that they had been taken by someone, or something, that moved silently in the night. But despite endless speculation, no one could explain how an entire family could vanish without a trace, in the middle of a locked home, while the rest of the world slept peacefully around them. In the weeks that followed the Miller family's disappearance, Maplewood was consumed by fear and confusion. The local police launched a full-scale investigation, treating the case as both a missing persons report and a possible crime scene. Officers combed through the neighborhood, knocking on every door, questioning neighbors, and reviewing any movement seen around the house that night. Search parties were formed, scouring the woods and nearby lakes, while helicopters circled overhead for days. Yet no footprints, no tire tracks, and no discarded belongings were ever recovered. It was as if the earth had swallowed the Millers whole. Detectives turned their focus inward, looking at the family's background. Mr. Miller, an accountant, had no criminal record and was described as quiet, dependable, and reserved. Miller was a schoolteacher who devoted her time to her children and her church. The kids, aged 7 and 10, were well liked in the community. Friends and co-workers alike insisted there was nothing unusual about them in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. No debts, no disputes, and no signs of distress. Their lives seemed ordinary, painfully ordinary, making their sudden vanishing all the more inexplicable. As months passed, leads began to dry up. A handful of tips trickled in, a supposed sighting of the family in another state, a strange phone call with heavy breathing reported by a neighbor, even rumors of cult activity in the nearby woods. Each lead was followed diligently, yet each ended the same way, with nothing concrete. The lack of progress frustrated investigators, who began to wonder if the case had been mishandled from the start. The one piece of evidence that might have shed light, an old camera taken from the house, was inexplicably shelved and never analyzed. By the end of the first year, the Miller case file had grown thick with reports, interviews, and photographs, but not a single answer. The media coverage slowed down, replaced by fresher headlines. The community, once rattled and paranoid, reluctantly moved on, though an air of unease always lingered on Maplewood streets. The Miller home was eventually sold, scrubbed clean of its chilling history, yet many locals avoided walking past it at night. Children whispered ghost stories about the family that once lived there, and some claimed the dog's frantic barking could still be heard if you stood too close. After nearly a decade of unanswered questions, the Miller disappearance was officially labeled a cold case. The thick folders of evidence were pushed into the archives, stacked among other unsolved mysteries gathering dust in the police department's basement. For years, no one touched it, not until 2004, when a curious officer stumbled upon the forgotten box, and noticed something strange inside the old family camera, film still intact, waiting in silence for someone to finally look at it. In 2004, 10 years after the Miller family's disappearance, The case was nothing more than a faded memory in Maplewood. Files sat buried in the police department's archives, boxes of evidence stacked in dimly lit storage rooms that officers rarely visited. One afternoon, during a routine reorganization, a young detective assigned to cold cases pulled down a box marked, "Miller Case, 1994. Inside, he found a mix of old items, notebooks filled with interviews, photographs of the Miller home, and plastic bags containing belongings recovered from the house. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a yellowing evidence tag, was something that hadn't been touched in a decade: the Miller family's camera. It was a simple 35 point and shoot camera, scratched and slightly worn, the kind of device every suburban family owned in the 1990s. Most would have dismissed it as insignificant, a household item left behind, but attached to it was a note that immediately caught the detective's attention. Film inside. Not developed. For reasons never fully explained, this piece of evidence had been logged, but never processed. Perhaps it was overlooked in the chaos of the initial investigation, or perhaps someone assumed it contained nothing more than family vacation photos. Whatever the reason, the camera had been sitting in silence for 10 long years. The detective turned the camera over in his hands, staring at the cold metal casing and the faint smudges that still marked its surface. He imagined the last hands to hold it. Maybe Mrs. Miller, capturing pictures of her children. Maybe one of the kids themselves, laughing as they snapped blurry photos around the house. But there was something unsettling about the weight of it, as though it carried a secret sealed within. He couldn't shake the feeling that this forgotten camera might hold the one clue that everyone else had missed. Without hesitation, the detective sent the film roll to the lab. The technicians, intrigued by the decade-old evidence, handled it with care, worried the film might be too degraded to produce clear images. As the negatives were slowly developed, shadows and shapes began to emerge, revealing fragments of a life frozen in time. The detective waited in tense silence, knowing that whatever surfaced could either reopen the case, or confirm nothing at all. When the prints were finally delivered, the detective flipped through them one by one. At first, the images were harmless, even heartwarming. Children smiling at a birthday party, a picnic in the park, and the parents posing together in their living room. But then the photos began to shift, becoming darker, stranger, as if someone else had taken over the camera. The detective froze, staring at what he was now holding in his hands, knowing these pictures could change everything about the Miller case. The first half of the photographs felt like a window into a normal family's life. Birthday candles glowing in a dimly lit kitchen, the children grinning with frosting on their cheeks, Mrs. Miller adjusting her husband's tie while he laughed. These were the kind of images anyone might expect to find on a family camera. But then, halfway through the roll, something changed. The smiles disappeared. The settings became darker, and the angles were off, tilted, and strangely distant, as though the photographer was hiding while taking them. One particular image made the detective's heart pound. It showed the Miller children asleep in their beds, the flash catching their faces in pale white light. But the photo had been taken from the doorway of their room, not by a parent tucking them in, but by someone standing in the shadows. Another photo followed Mr. and Mrs. Miller sitting in the living room, reading quietly, completely unaware that a camera was watching them from behind a partially open door. Whoever was holding that camera had been inside their home, stalking them without their knowledge. The further the detective flipped, the worse the photographs became. A picture of the back hallway, no family members in sight, just a long corridor stretching into darkness. Another of the kitchen at night, chairs pushed back, as if someone had been walking silently through the house while the Millers slept. And then, there were photos of the basement, dimly lit and unfocused, yet unmistakably showing the Millers' belongings. The unsettling part was that none of the family members were in these shots. They were simply absent. Every new photo felt like a trespasser's record, a silent diary of someone moving through the home unnoticed. The detective's hands began to tremble as he studied the sequence. There was a chilling pattern. The photos were moving closer and closer to the family, starting from empty rooms, then watching from doorways, and finally standing right beside them. It was as though whoever was behind the lens was building up to something, documenting each step before whatever happened that night. Then came the final image that made the detective's breath catch. It wasn't just a blurry angle or a hidden shot. It was staged, deliberate, and far too real. The Miller family stood together in the basement, eyes wide, their faces pale with terror. The only light came from the camera's flash, catching them frozen in fear. And just behind them, in the shadows of the basement wall, loomed a figure. Its form was tall, distorted, and its eyes reflected with a sickening glow, as if the flash had revealed something not meant to be seen. The final photograph was unlike anything else on the roll. It wasn't a casual snapshot, and it didn't feel accidental. It was deliberate, almost staged. The Miller family stood together in the basement, pressed closely against the far wall. The flash illuminated their faces in stark, unnatural white, and every expression was one of raw, unfiltered fear. The father's arm stretched slightly forward as if shielding his children, while Mrs. Miller clutched them tightly. Their eyes weren't focused on the camera, but on something just over the photographer's shoulder, or perhaps something standing directly behind them. The longer the detective stared at the picture, the more details emerged. The basement looked unfinished, its walls bare concrete, with faint cracks spidering upward toward the ceiling. But just behind the family, half hidden in the shadows, a tall figure loomed. Its outline didn't match the shape of a human being. The body seemed stretched unnaturally long, and where its face should have been, there was only a blur, except for 2 pinpoints of glowing light, where eyes might have been. The reflection from the flash had caught them perfectly, as if they were staring directly into the lens. What unsettled the detective most was the clarity of the family's fear. This wasn't surprise or confusion. It was the kind of terror that came from knowing there was no escape. The children's wide, tear-filled eyes locked into the camera, silently pleading. Mr. Miller's jaw was clenched, frozen mid-breath. Mrs. Miller's hands were trembling so hard that they blurred slightly in the photo, a small smear of motion against the stillness of everything else. The family looked like they had been forced to stand there, as if someone had positioned them for this very shot. The photograph raised disturbing questions. Who had taken it? If the Millers were all in the frame, then who stood behind the camera? The figure in the shadows couldn't have been the photographer. It was too far back, its glowing eyes fixated on the family. Yet someone, or something, had pressed the shutter button. The idea of a fifth presence in that basement, unseen but controlling the moment, chilled the detective to his core. He flipped the photo over, hoping for a date stamp or some clue scribbled on the back, but it was blank. Nothing to identify when or why it had been taken. Only the grim image itself remained, burned into film that had waited 10 long years to reveal its secret. The detective placed it on the table under the harsh fluorescent lights, unable to look away, knowing this was the last time anyone had ever seen the Millers alive. The photograph forced investigators to return to the Miller home, a place most officers had long since avoided. By 2004, the house had new owners who were reluctant to let strangers dig into its history, but after showing them the developed images, they quickly agreed. The basement, the same one captured in the final photograph, looked ordinary enough at first. Old storage boxes lined the walls, dusty tools hung from hooks, and a faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. But when the detectives began to inspect the concrete walls more closely, they noticed something odd. A hollow sound when one section was tapped. Sledgehammers were brought in, and soon chunks of concrete crumbled away, revealing something no one expected. A narrow tunnel hidden behind the basement wall. The opening was just wide enough for a person to slip through, coated in dust and spiderwebs that suggested it hadn't been touched in years. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before crawling inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. What they found was unsettling. A man-made passage stretching deep beneath the ground, snaking toward the edge of the woods that bordered the property. The walls of the tunnel were rough and damp, but what caught everyone's attention were the markings. Carved into the stone were strange symbols and patterns, uneven and jagged as though made in haste, yet repeated over and over. Some resembled crude drawings of faces with hollow eyes. Others were shapes that no one could immediately identify. The deeper the officers went, the more markings appeared, covering nearly every surface as though someone had spent hours, maybe days, scratching them into the rock. Halfway through the tunnel, the team found remnants of something darker. A small patch of the floor was stained, and when samples were taken back to the lab, the results confirmed what they feared: traces of human blood. Though the samples had long since dried and degraded, they were enough to suggest that violence had occurred within those walls. There were no bones, no personal belongings, and no signs of where the Millers had gone next. Just the unsettling knowledge that something had happened there, hidden beneath their own home. When the tunnel finally opened into the woods, investigators emerged into a dense patch of trees less than a mile from the property. The path was narrow, overgrown, and led deeper into the forest where light barely reached the ground. It was as though the tunnel had been designed as an escape route, or perhaps as a way in. Standing there, flashlights trembling in their hands, the officers couldn't help but wonder if the figure in the photograph had used this very passage to enter the Miller home undetected, and if it had ever truly left. The discovery of the photographs and the hidden tunnel reignited the Miller case with a force no one expected. A file that had been dormant for a decade was suddenly thrust back into the spotlight. Detectives, some who had worked the case in the 1990s and others who were new to the force, gathered in a conference room to review the evidence. The chilling images were spread across the table, each one a silent testimony to the family's final days. The last photograph, showing the Millers in the basement with the shadowy figure, was pinned to the board at the front of the room. A haunting reminder that something had been overlooked for 10 years. Experts were called in to analyze the negatives. They studied the grain of the film, the lighting, and the possible distortions caused by the camera itself. Yet nothing about the glowing eyes in the final image could be explained by photography errors. The reflections were too sharp, too deliberate, as though the figure had been standing there, watching. Some investigators suggested it was nothing more than a person caught in motion, their features blurred by the flash. Others weren't so sure. One analyst, visibly shaken, admitted that whatever the figure was, it didn't align with human proportions. The case files were reopened to the public, and with that came a flood of new tips. Some were ridiculous. People claiming to have seen the Millers living under new identities, or suggesting alien abductions. But a handful of leads were more disturbing. One caller claimed they had lived near the Millers at the time of their disappearance, and had often seen a tall man standing at the edge of the woods late at night. Another anonymous letter described hearing strange chanting in the forest behind the Miller home, weeks before the family vanished. None of these accounts had been included in the original investigation. As investigators retraced old interviews, they realized how many details had been dismissed in 1994. Neighbors who heard scratching noises at night, children who claimed to see a figure watching from the tree line, and a local hiker who reported stumbling across carved symbols deep in the woods. All had been filed away as irrelevant. Now, paired with the tunnel markings and the photographs, these accounts felt chillingly significant. It was no longer just a missing persons case. It was something more. Something that hovered between the criminal and the unexplainable. The renewed investigation spread beyond Maplewood. FBI consultants were brought in, along with specialists in folklore and psychology. The photographs circulated through confidential channels, studied by people who didn't always wear badges. Still, despite the new resources, no one could determine who, or what, the figure in the basement truly was. All they knew was that the Miller case, once forgotten, had returned to haunt them, demanding answers that might never come. And so, after decades of searching, the Miller family's fate remains one of the darkest mysteries in Maplewood's history. The photographs gave investigators a glimpse of their final moments, the tunnel revealed something sinister beneath their home, and the stories from neighbors hinted at a presence that had been watching all along. Yet no bodies were ever found, no culprit was ever named, and no one could explain the figure that appeared in the last photo. Some believe the Millers were victims of a disturbed intruder, who knew the house better than they did. Others whisper of something unearthly. A presence that stalked them from the woods and dragged them into the shadows, never to return. Whatever the truth may be, the Miller case remains unsolved to this day, a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying answers are the ones we never find. So the question lingers, unanswered after all these years: who, or what, was standing behind the Miller family in that final photograph?
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.